The War of Jenkins Ear. When one severed ear started an 8-year global conflict. What if I told you that a single human ear once triggered an 8-year war that reshaped 2 continents, involved 5 major powers, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives? Not a metaphorical ear, an actual severed, pickled ear that a sea captain carried around in a jar for 7 years like the world's most gruesome conversation starter. This is the story of how one man's missing body part became the excuse for a global conflict that had absolutely nothing to do with ears. Chapter 1. The Ear That Started It All. April 9th, 1731. Captain Robert Jenkins is sailing his merchant ship, the Rebecca, through Caribbean waters when Spanish Coast Guards board his vessel. They're looking for contraband, specifically checking if British merchants are smuggling goods and avoiding Spanish taxes. The Spanish captain, Julio León Fandiño, searches the ship and finds absolutely nothing illegal. But here's where things get medieval. Instead of apologizing and leaving, Fandiño decides to make an example. He ties Jenkins to the mast and cuts off his left ear with a cutlass, allegedly saying, "Take this to your king and tell him I will do the same to him if he dares to come here." Jenkins, bleeding and probably reconsidering his career choices, picks up his severed ear and keeps it. Because apparently, in the 18th century, holding on to your own body parts was considered good evidence for future legal proceedings. Chapter 2. The 7-Year Preservation Project. Now most people would have thrown their ear overboard and filed this under Terrible Tuesday. But Captain Jenkins? He went home to England and preserved his ear in a jar of brandy like some macabre trophy. For 7 years he carried this pickled ear around, showing it to anyone who would listen. "Look at what the Spanish did to me," he'd say, producing his ear like a business card from hell. Friends would invite him to dinner parties just for the shock value. "Oh, you simply must meet Captain Jenkins. He has the most extraordinary story, and props." Meanwhile, tensions between Britain and Spain were already simmering. British merchants wanted access to Spanish colonial markets. Spain wanted to protect its monopoly, and both sides were looking for an excuse to fight. They just needed the right catalyst, or the right ear. Chapter 3. Parliament's Theatre of the Absurd. 1738. 7 years after the ear incident, British politicians are looking for reasons to go to war with Spain. Trade disputes are boring, but a severed ear? That's marketing gold. Captain Jenkins is summoned to testify before Parliament. Picture this. A room full of powdered wigs and fancy coats, and in walks this weathered sea captain carrying a jar with a floating ear like he's auditioning for a horror movie. "Tell us, Captain," the politicians ask, "what did the Spanish do to you?" Jenkins dramatically produces his pickled ear and tells his story. The parliamentarians gasp in horror, not just at the ear, but at the opportunity this represents. Here was their casus belli, their justification for war, bobbing gently in brandy. War was declared on October 19, 1739. The official reason? The violation of British maritime rights and the mutilation of Captain Jenkins. The real reason? Money, trade routes, and colonial expansion. The ear was just the excuse they'd been waiting for. Chapter 4. When one war becomes 4 wars. Here's where things get complicated. What started as the War of Jenkins Ear quickly merged with 3 other major conflicts happening simultaneously across Europe and the Americas. There was the Austrian succession crisis, where half of Europe was fighting over who got to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. There was King George's War in North America, where British and French colonists were settling old scores with muskets and scalping knives. And there were various colonial conflicts in India, where European trading companies were basically playing Risk with real armies. Suddenly, Jenkins's ear had somehow triggered a global conflict involving Britain, Spain, France, Austria, Prussia, and their various colonies. It was like the 18th century version of World War I, except it all started with preserved body parts instead of an assassination. Chapter 5. The Caribbean Catastrophe. The British were confident this would be a quick victory. "We have the world's greatest navy," they declared. "What could go wrong against the declining Spanish Empire?" Everything. Everything could go wrong. Admiral Edward Vernon attacked the Spanish fortress of Cartagena de Indias in 1741 with 186 ships and 23,000 men, one of the largest naval expeditions in history. The plan was simple: sail in, blast the fortress, declare victory, go home for tea and medals. Instead, they ran into Blas de Lezo, a Spanish commander who was basically the Chuck Norris of naval warfare. This man had lost an eye, an arm, and a leg in previous battles, but was still commanding ships like he was collecting body parts for a set. Lezo defended Cartagena with brilliant tactics, devastating disease outbreaks among the British troops, and sheer stubborn determination. The British lost 18,000 men and retreated in humiliation. Back in London, they had already minted victory medals and named streets after their conquest of Cartagena. Awkward. Chapter 6. The Global Domino Effect. While the British were getting their naval ambitions crushed in the Caribbean, the war was spreading like wildfire across the globe. In North America, British and French colonists were scalping each other with unprecedented enthusiasm. In Europe, armies were marching back and forth across the continent, redrawing maps with cannon fire. In India, trading company armies were discovering that the best way to secure spice routes was through strategic genocide. The irony was delicious. A war that started over one man's severed ear had become a global conflict where millions of people were losing various body parts. Jenkins's ear had somehow become the butterfly wing that caused a hurricane of international warfare. Chapter 7. The Anticlimactic Peace. By 1748, everyone was exhausted, bankrupt, and had forgotten why they started fighting in the first place. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed, which basically said, let's all agree to stop killing each other and pretend the last 8 years didn't happen. The final territorial changes? Minimal. Most conquered territories were returned, borders were restored to their pre-war positions, and the major powers agreed to disagree about trade rights. It was like playing a board game for 8 years only to reset all the pieces to their starting positions. Captain Jenkins? He had died in 1745, probably wondering how his severed ear had caused a world war. His ear's ultimate fate remains unknown. It either was lost, thrown away, or is sitting in some forgotten museum storage room, still pickled and still historically significant. The War of Jenkins Ear teaches us several important lessons about human nature and international relations. First, never underestimate how much politicians love a good prop for their war speeches. A floating ear in a jar is apparently worth more than 1,000 diplomatic protests. Second, wars are rarely about their stated causes. Jenkins's ear was just the excuse. The real reasons were trade monopolies, colonial expansion, and good old-fashioned imperial rivalry. Third, sometimes the smallest incidents can trigger the largest consequences. One captain's bad day in 1731 led to a global conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the balance of power between European empires. And finally, if someone cuts off your ear, maybe don't keep it in a jar for 7 years. That's just good life advice. Next time, the football war, when El Salvador and Honduras fought a 4-day war over a soccer match, proving that sports fans will literally go to war over their teams.